This week, as we wrap up EM360, Homeland Security Law and Policy, I'd like for us to recap just a little bit and also step back from some of the details that we've been discussing to think about a couple of things more broadly. We've talked about a number of legal authorities, responsibilities, legal concepts, policy issues in Homeland Security and in emergency management, and we have seen, and I hope you've realized that we've only scratched the surface of the legal documents that are relevant to what we do in Homeland Security and emergency management and the legal and policy issues that are out there. I want you to keep in mind as you do whatever you are doing in your career and whatever you will do in the future, that understanding the legal foundations and parameters of your work is important. And that may mean some continuing education or some additional training if you move into a new role may be needed. So we've talked about legal authority and responsibility. We've talked about some key constitutional principles and protections of individual liberties that sometimes restrict or constrain the actions that government agencies and government personnel take, or that should perhaps constrain them or guide them, it may be a better word. And we've touched on legal processes such as administrative procedures and court and judicial processes. If you work in law enforcement or in some other roles, you may get more into legal procedure and court procedure. We've just sort of nibbled around the edges of that in this class. So I encourage you to think about what are the legal issues and the legal foundations that are important perhaps in the work that you do or that you want to do, and take action to learn more about those legal issues and legal principles, those legal foundations, and keep up to date and contemporary with whether it's case law or changes in law and policy, so that you can both act legally and in alignment with constitutional requirements, and also that helps you act with confidence in your decision making and the steps you take in your job. Some of the challenges that I think you're probably thinking about and talking about and writing about this week as we think about Homeland Security challenges. One of the ones I thought of is that oftentimes law doesn't keep up with reality, with what's going on in technology, for example, or it may lag a little bit behind some of the tactics that are used by adversaries or in intelligence gathering. So just the fact that law moves slowly can be a challenge in some way. So that's a big, kind of a broad macro issue. Another thought we might consider is the fact that in our legal system in the United States, it's built on whether an agency or a court has jurisdiction over the subjects of a case, whether it's a criminal case or a civil case. Is there jurisdiction for that court to hear that particular case or the issue? When we think about cybercrime, cyber terrorism, cyber attacks, and even some incidents in foreign countries that are physical in nature, we see that jurisdiction can get complicated and can be a challenge. So jurisdiction in the legal sense to investigate and to prosecute or to hear a case can be an interesting challenge when we think about some of the issues that Homeland Security is involved in the 21st century. And then, as we've suggested in some of our discussions in this course, the need to balance public safety and security with the constitutional protections of individual rights and freedoms. We can't throw out either side of that equation. Both are important, and we need to think about what we're doing, how we understand law and constitutional principles, and how do we improve our training and our policies and procedures to work on that balance and respect that balance to both provide as much security and safety as we can while respecting constitutional protections. We've also talked a little bit about enforceability and the enforceability of provisions in law or in regulation. Sometimes we may have things on the books that are either difficult to enforce, or perhaps an agency may not have the resources to enforce the way we would like for the agency to. So the enforceability of some provisions can be a challenge. We might say we're going to go after entities that are doing X, Y, or Z that's nefarious on the internet, but actually being able to track them down and enforce those provisions may be a serious challenge. And then one of the other things I thought we mentioned as a challenge is the factor that climate change brings. When I say changing landscape, I mean literally that with sea level rise and other things going on, our climate, our world, even our landscape is changing, and this will cause some legal upheavals, I predict, in the coming decades. We see increasing temperatures, which are going to change climate patterns, maybe agricultural production. Rising water levels may cause all sorts of things, from increasing damage from severe storms to changes in where property lines are. Well, the property lines may still exist, but the property line might be underwater. So we may have legal challenges about some property uses and property rights. As we think about what may happen, what's predicted to happen with climate change in the next few decades and in the next 100 years, we can see that some serious legal challenges will probably result. As we think about mitigating damage, we might think about regulations that have been proposed and actually in force in some states right now and in other countries regarding reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which are known to contribute to global warming and climate change. We also get more into the idea of local zoning and development restrictions to prevent development, for example, or control development in hazard-prone areas. So those kinds of local laws may be very relevant to thinking about adapting to things like sea level rise. We may have more of those kinds of issues also arise when we're talking about repairs and rebuilding post-disaster, that we may have to do more adaptation to avoid future damage if we're in an area, for example, that's flood-prone or prone to storm surge from something like a hurricane or tropical storm. Maybe have liability issues related to climate change. We may have some battles about whether certain types of emissions and the companies that produce them out into the atmosphere are liable for some of the effects of climate change. We're starting to see some rumblings of those kinds of lawsuits. We'll see more battles over rights to water and water conservation, such as the lawsuits that have been going on between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida for more than 20 years. So we'll see more disputes over who has the preference or the rights to certain water sources as water gets more scarce or and less available in some areas. And as I mentioned, we may see changes in property lines or accessibility of property along waterways or in floodplains. So those are just some of the legal issues that I see as possibly arising related to climate change. On the worldwide level, if the impacts of climate change continue and are severe, we may see that it also affects immigration and people moving from one area to another because of the changes in climate, whether it's because their island is no longer and it's covered up with ocean, or perhaps it may be because the ability to grow agriculture and feed the population may not be possible because of drought, and people have to migrate to other locations for survivability. So we can see some of these kinds of legal issues that may be coming related to climate change. One of the other challenges I figure some of you will discuss this week in our assignments is related to cyber risk, whether it's cyber fraud, cyber crime, cyber terrorism, hacking for fun, sabotage for military purposes, cyber warfare. There's a lot of risk out there, and it poses, certainly as we've seen, a lot of practical challenges, but also has some legal challenges in the sense that while unauthorized use of a computer and hacking and cyber fraud are all crimes under U.S. federal law, it can be difficult to identify the perpetrator who's carrying it out and to track them to where they are. They have the ability through the code and the software that they use oftentimes to conceal where they are and who they are. Finding and bringing perpetrators of cybercrime and terrorism to justice is a special challenge in terms of having the technology skills, the resources to find them and to enforce our laws because of the technical nature and because it can be a long process to find and get to the root of where a major attack has come from. We can see this could also have major national security and policy implications if we were to see more attacks on supervisory control and data acquisition systems. In other words, the electronic control systems for things like the power grid or nuclear power plants, or perhaps intrusions into voting systems that are managed electronically. So we can see that there might be even additional legal and policy issues or a potential crisis if we had major attacks that were focused on some of that type of infrastructure. And another sort of macro issue or interesting challenge I want to raise is the complexity and sometimes the tension in our society. We have seen increased polarization from a political standpoint. We have seen in some cases increased racial and religious tensions. From time to time we see severe economic downturns where some part of the population may be disgruntled enough to rise up, whether we're talking about in the U.S. or in other countries. And we've certainly also seen desperate conditions come about after major disasters. So these things can tend to increase civil unrest, public protests, sometimes even violence. And when we think about Homeland Security, we realize that those kinds of incidents and the causes of them are something we have to think about as part of our legal and policy discussions, as part of our legal and policy challenges. We also know that we have a First Amendment that guarantees a right to free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and that can provide another challenge when we think about trying to address and control negative and dangerous connections that are made via the internet. For example, whether it's radicalizing people to fight with terror groups, or maybe it's propaganda about one side or another, and yet we still have to respect our protections for freedom of speech and freedom of association. So again, some of our complexities in our society and our system of government pose challenges that we need to think about how to deal with. So as we think about challenges in Homeland Security law and policy, we'll weave in the beautiful challenge we have of respecting our freedoms of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, while at the same time doing our best to protect public safety and security. So I hope you have enjoyed our conversations and our study in this class. I look forward to your work this week. Please get out there and do good work, whatever it is you do.